She's gone. She's not breathing. Please help me. The most heartbreaking serial killer story you will ever hear. In a quiet Oregon town, a young woman's final moments revealed the face of a cold-blooded serial killer hiding in plain sight. Her name was Jessica Monroe. Her story will haunt you. But what happened next shocked everyone. Salem, Oregon. A city known for its small-town charm, historic streets, and quiet suburban neighborhoods. But behind the calm, evil was moving. Jessica Monroe was just 27. Bright, free-spirited. A beloved elementary school teacher who spent weekends volunteering at a local animal shelter. And then there was Daniel Harker. A 35-year-old man always seen around town but never really noticed. He blended into the background, the kind of man no one suspected, until it was too late. This is her story. And his secret. We post daily. Subscribe so you never miss a case. Jessica Monroe was 27 years old, and in every way she represented hope for the small community of Salem, Oregon. She was a second-grade teacher at Fairview Elementary, the kind of teacher parents requested by name. Children said she made learning feel like play. Her classroom was bright with handmade decorations, paper butterflies, finger-painted suns, and encouraging quotes that lined the walls. For her, teaching wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Outside school, Jessica lived a quiet but meaningful life. She rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, a place decorated with second-hand furniture she restored herself. Every Saturday morning, she volunteered at the local animal shelter, walking dogs and cleaning cages. Friends described her as compassionate, the type who noticed when someone was left out and made sure they were included. She called her younger sister every night before bed, just to talk about little things: what she cooked for dinner, what book she was reading, or what funny thing a student said that day. But underneath her sunshine personality, there were whispers of unease. Jessica confided to her closest friend that she sometimes felt like someone was watching her. Late at night, when she pulled into her parking lot, she caught glimpses of a shadow near the lamppost. Once, she thought she saw the same man in the grocery store on 3 different occasions, always lingering just an aisle behind. She brushed it off as paranoia, joked that she was just being dramatic. Still, she double-checked her locks more often than before. Only a few blocks away lived Daniel Harker, 35 years old, quiet, withdrawn. He worked the night shift stocking shelves at a neighborhood supermarket. Most people never noticed him. Those who did described him as polite, if somewhat distant. He rented a small, dim apartment that reeked faintly of mildew. Neighbors rarely saw him during the day, but at night he walked. Long, aimless walks through side streets and alleyways. His landlord once complained of strange noises and foul odors coming from his unit, but nothing ever came of it. Daniel seemed ordinary enough, invisible even. And that was his greatest weapon. While Jessica spent her evenings planning lessons, grading papers, and journaling with a cup of tea, Daniel was watching. He kept a notebook filled with observations. The time Jessica left for work, the route she walked her dog, the hour her lights went dark. In his mind, she wasn't a stranger, she was already his. Friends began noticing changes in Jessica. She seemed distracted at coffee dates. A little tense, like she was waiting for something to happen. Once she confided, "I don't know why, but I feel like I'm being followed." Her friends reassured her it was probably nothing. Just nerves. But it wasn't nothing. Daniel's walks weren't random. They were deliberate. Calculated. Each step pulling him closer into Jessica's world. And by October of that year, his fixation had transformed into something far more dangerous. Jessica had no idea that her ordinary life, her job, her apartment, her routines were being cataloged by the very man who would soon rip it all away. Because what she didn't know was that Daniel wasn't just watching. He was preparing. October 14, 2019. The rain began just after sunset, soft at first, then heavy, hammering against rooftops and sidewalks across Salem. The streets emptied early. Curtains were drawn. But inside her small apartment, Jessica Monroe was still awake. She had just returned from the animal shelter, her coat damp, shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. She kicked them off, laughed to herself about how drenched she was, and put the kettle on for tea. What Jessica didn't know was that Daniel Harker was already watching from the shadows outside. He had been waiting for hours, standing just out of sight, the storm covering his footsteps. He had followed her home before. But tonight was different. Tonight was the night he decided he would act. Around 10:45 p.m., neighbors later reported hearing a faint knock, followed by silence. Jessica likely assumed it was a delivery mistake or a neighbor. When she opened her door, Daniel forced his way in. The scene that unfolded was brutal and chaotic. Jessica fought back with everything she had. Police would later find the living room torn apart, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered, curtains ripped from their rods. She screamed, loud enough for one neighbor to pause their television and turn down the volume. But the storm swallowed the sound. Jessica scratched, clawed, did anything she could to resist. Investigators discovered fragments of Daniel's skin beneath her fingernails, a silent testimony of her struggle. But Daniel was stronger, fueled by obsession and control. He had brought rope. He had prepared. At 11:12 p.m., a neighbor heard a crash and a single scream. They hesitated. The rain made everything unclear. Was it an argument, furniture falling, maybe just thunder? They waited, listening, but no sound came again. It was at 11:27 p.m. that the 911 call came in. A different neighbor reported strange noises and furniture breaking next door. Officers were dispatched immediately. When police arrived, the building was eerily silent except for the hum of the storm outside. They knocked. No answer. After forcing entry, their flashlights swept across the room. What they found was horrifying. Jessica Monroe lay on the floor of her living room, motionless. Rope marks cut deep into her wrists. Bruising circled her neck. The tea she had made still sat cooling on the counter, untouched. Daniel was gone. The first responding officer's notes described the apartment as a war zone. Muddy boot prints trailed across the carpet. A cigarette butt, still faintly smelling of tobacco, lay near the window. Shards of glass crunched underfoot. One officer later admitted the silence was the worst part. No signs of forced entry beyond the door. No sign of the killer. Just the aftermath of violence that had ended a young woman's life. Word spread quickly through Salem. The beloved teacher was dead. Shock turned into fear. Was this random? Or was there something much darker living among them? Police sealed the scene. Evidence bags filled with fragments of Jessica's final fight. And somewhere in the rain-soaked night, Daniel Harker disappeared into the darkness. But he hadn't disappeared completely. The clues he left behind would soon tell investigators a story far more chilling than anyone imagined. Because Jessica Monroe's murder was only the beginning. Detectives arrived at Jessica Monroe's apartment within the hour. The rain had slowed, but the air inside the apartment was still heavy, thick with the aftermath of violence. Evidence markers littered the living room: overturned furniture, shattered glass, muddy footprints. To investigators, one thing was clear: Jessica had fought hard. The first priority was securing DNA. The scratches on her hands, the skin trapped under her fingernails, the cigarette butt left behind, each one carried the promise of a lead. But in those early hours, detectives faced an unsettling reality. The killer had vanished without a trace. Salem wasn't a big city. Word of the murder spread quickly and fear took hold. Parents clutched their children tighter. The community wanted answers. Detectives began the difficult task of reconstructing Jessica's final hours. They interviewed neighbors. One recalled hearing a scream, another described a heavy crash. One woman said she saw a tall man in a hooded jacket near the parking lot earlier that night, but the storm had blurred the details. Investigators dug into Jessica's life. They spoke with her co-workers at Fairview Elementary, her friends, her family. Everyone described her as loved, happy, and free of enemies. But one comment from her best friend stuck out. Jessica had recently confided she felt watched. She said she thought someone was following her, the friend recalled. That changed the scope of the case. This wasn't random. This was targeted. Detectives considered possible suspects. Ex-boyfriends were questioned. A co-worker who had shown unusual interest in her was investigated. Even a delivery driver who had stopped by the apartment complex that night was briefly held. But DNA cleared them all. Each lead collapsed into frustration. But then, a breakthrough. The cigarette butt. Forensic testing revealed DNA. When cross-checked against the state database, it hit a match. Daniel Harker, 35 years old, a grocery store employee. No violent record, but a sealed juvenile file hinted at past aggression. At first glance, Daniel didn't fit the picture of a killer. He had no direct connection to Jessica. No known relationship. But surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras began to piece the puzzle together. Investigators saw a figure matching his description, walking the streets around Jessica's building on multiple nights leading up to the murder. Still, police needed more. They tailed him, watching his every move. What they discovered chilled them. Daniel wasn't just hiding. He was patrolling. Officers observed him walking late at night, lingering outside apartment complexes, pacing near bus stops where young women often passed. But then, detectives obtained a search warrant for his apartment. Inside they found journals. Dozens of them. each filled with neat, obsessive notes. Names, times, places. Jessica's name appeared again and again. One entry just days before her death read, Jessica. Alone. Lights out at 10:43. The journals were the smoking gun. They didn't just tie Daniel to Jessica, they tied him to others. Police began re-examining unsolved disappearances in the area. A waitress, a college student, a young mother. None had ever been linked before. Now investigators saw a pattern. Salem wasn't facing a random act of violence. It was facing a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. And for the first time, detectives began to wonder, was Jessica Monroe the first, or just the latest? Because the journals hinted at victims no one had even reported missing. On November 6, 2019, less than a month after Jessica Monroe's murder, police made their move. Detectives had been building the case piece by piece, DNA on the cigarette butt, the scratches linking back to him, the chilling journals cataloging Jessica's life. But what sealed it was surveillance footage from a convenience store showing Daniel Harker the night of the murder. His clothes were soaked, mud clung to his boots, and on his neck, faint scratches. When investigators confronted him, Daniel barely reacted. No panic, no outrage, just silence. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Jessica Monroe. The trial that followed gripped Salem. Families packed the courtroom. Reporters crowded the entrance. Jessica's parents sat in the front row, holding hands, their faces carved with grief. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. The DNA match, the journals, the surveillance. They painted Daniel as a predator, a man who lived to stalk, to plan, to control. Jurors listened in stunned silence as the pages of his journals were read aloud. Details of Jessica's comings and goings, right down to the hour she switched off her bedroom light. The defense tried to argue he was mentally unstable, that the journals were fantasies, and not proof of action. But the evidence was too strong. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. The verdict, guilty. Daniel Harker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But while the courtroom erupted in relief, a darker shadow lingered. Because Jessica's murder may not have been his first. Investigators had reopened several unsolved cases after finding Daniel's journals. 3 women, Rachel, a waitress, Brianna, a college student, and Angela, a young mother, had vanished years earlier. Their names, along with disturbing notes about their routines, appeared in Daniel's writings. Yet without bodies, prosecutors couldn't bring additional charges. To this day, Daniel refuses to speak about them. He sits in his prison cell, calm, almost smug, never answering questions about the missing. For Jessica's family, the verdict brought some closure, but not peace. Her sister later said in an interview, "We know he killed Jessica, but we'll never know how many others. That's what keeps me awake at night." Salem, too, carries the scars. 4 months after the trial, parents wouldn't let their children walk alone. Apartment complexes doubled their locks. Women changed their routines, fearful of shadows in parking lots and footsteps behind them. The case became a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it lives just down the street. Daniel Harker will die behind bars. But the unanswered question remains, how many other lives did he take before Jessica? And how many families still wait for answers that may never come? Because while justice was served for Jessica Monroe, the truth about Daniel Harker's past may still be out there. Serial killers are often painted as monsters. But the terrifying truth is that most of them look ordinary. Daniel Harker was no exception. On the surface, he was quiet, polite, and forgettable. But psychologists call men like him organized offenders. They are meticulous, deliberate, and obsessed with control. Daniel's journals revealed this obsession in black and white. He tracked Jessica's movements for weeks, even months. The time she left for work. The nights she stayed up late. The exact moment her lights turned off. This wasn't impulsive rage, it was ritual. He rehearsed the crime long before he acted. Experts suggest his motive wasn't purely violence, it was domination. Stalking gave him a sense of power. Following women in silence, cataloging their lives, and then choosing the moment to strike. In his mind, Jessica wasn't just a woman living her life, she was a project, something to study and possess. Daniel also fit patterns seen in predatory offenders. He worked nights, lived alone, and walked the streets in darkness. These habits weren't random, they fed his urges. Isolation protected his secrets. Routine walks became hunting grounds. And then there's the chilling detail investigators found in his journals. He rarely wrote about emotion. No anger. No hatred. Just observation. Cold facts, written like notes in a science experiment. To him, his victims weren't people. They were objects in his control. Psychologists argue this detachment is key. By stripping his victims of humanity, he justified what he did. And that's what makes killers like Daniel so terrifying. They don't act out of sudden rage. They act out of careful, calculated desire. In Daniel's case, the desire was to watch, to follow, to wait, and finally, to take. Jessica Monroe's life was bright. She was a teacher, a sister, a friend. She lived for the small joys, helping children learn, caring for animals, writing in her journal. She deserved decades of laughter and love. Instead, her life was cut short by a man who saw her not as a human being, but as a target. Her story reminds us that danger doesn't always come from shadows and alleyways. Sometimes it lives just down the street. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you'd never notice. Daniel Harker will die behind prison walls. But the unanswered question remains, how many other lives did he take before Jessica? And how many families are still waiting for the truth? We may never know the full story. But Jessica's name will not be forgotten. What do you think, was Jessica his only victim, or are there others still unaccounted for? Tell us your theory in the comments. And if this case gripped you, don't stop here. Subscribe and watch our next story.